General Hospital will reveal Kai was once the embodiment of hope in Port Charles, a brilliant young medical student, strikingly handsome and burning with ambition. He was the kind of person people instinctively believed in, someone who carried both the intelligence of a future surgeon and the empathy of a healer. When he volunteered to undergo a groundbreaking experimental procedure, a surgery that had never before been attempted on a human subject, many saw him as both a pioneer and a hero. His courage was lauded in press conferences funded by Drew, with headlines in local and regional papers calling him the new face of scientific faith and medical renewal. Drew himself, a politician with growing ambitions and an appetite for legacy, took every opportunity to showcase Kai as a symbol of what innovation and funding could achieve when guided by bold leadership and trust in the future. But that image shattered at the very moment it was supposed to be immortalized. At the glittering nurses' ball, under the dazzling lights and before a captivated audience who had come to celebrate medicine, hope, and community, Kai collapsed. One moment he was standing proudly in a designer tuxedo, his recovery seemingly complete, and the next, his legs buckled underneath him. The orchestra's melody halted. The room gasped as Kai crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Trina, seated at the edge of the stage, screamed and ran to him, her elegant gown tangling as she dropped to her knees. For several long seconds, a cold, deafening silence spread through the ballroom. Guests stood frozen, unable to reconcile the man lying motionless on the floor with the medical miracle they had come to celebrate. Chaos erupted as paramedics rushed to the stage. Photographers captured the surreal sight of Kai being stretchered out under the same lights that had moments earlier shone down on him as a symbol of triumph. But the true aftershock of the night came not from Kai's collapse, but from Trina's response. Standing alone at the podium, her voice shaking but resolute, her tear-streaked face hardened by fury and betrayal, Trina turned toward the flashing cameras and delivered a blow that would reshape public perception of the man who had made it all happen. She held Drew responsible. She accused him of pushing Kai into a risky, unproven surgery with empty promises and exaggerated projections. She said he had pressured Kai with lofty speeches about legacy and change, while the clinical data remained inconclusive. The words cut through the silence like a knife. The audience, comprised of doctors, donors, community leaders, and journalists, sat in stunned disbelief. Drew, who had been standing near the wings preparing to give a keynote address, was blindsided. In a matter of minutes, the man celebrated as a patron of progress was recast as a self-serving politician willing to sacrifice lives for personal gain. In the hours that followed, the emergency room at General Hospital confirmed Trina's worst fears. After a battery of scans and neurological assessments, doctors informed Kai that he would never walk again. The nerve damage was irreversible. The surgical procedure, once heralded as a breakthrough, had failed catastrophically. Not only had the progress made in the days after surgery been illusory, but the deterioration in Kai's condition was now accelerating. He was paralyzed from the waist down, with no hope of regaining mobility. The news crushed Kai. The once radiant young man descended into anguish and disbelief. He had put everything on the line, his body, his future, his faith in science, only to be left broken. The physical pain was overwhelming, but it paled in comparison to the psychological torment. He felt betrayed not just by the procedure, but by the man who had convinced him to believe in it. In a moment of sheer devastation, Kai lashed out at Drew, blaming him for everything, for the manipulation, the false confidence, the betrayal cloaked in encouragement. He accused Drew of turning him into a pawn in a political campaign disguised as a research initiative. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within 24 hours, the story made national headlines. Medical miracle turns into tragedy at nurse's ball, screamed the headlines. News outlets dug deeper into the funding behind the experimental procedure, uncovering that Drew had pushed the timeline forward in hopes of making an announcement before the next election cycle. Leaked internal emails suggested that Drew had known about the potential long-term risks but had brushed them aside in favor of presenting short-term success. What was once viewed as a visionary investment now appeared to be an act of reckless ambition. The medical community turned its back on Drew. Ethics boards launched formal investigations into the surgery, the clinical trials, and the approval process. Advocacy groups for medical transparency and patient rights demanded accountability. Protesters gathered outside Drew's office, holding signs with Kai's picture and slogans like, "Patients are not politics." A class action lawsuit was rumored, as other patients involved in Drew-backed programs began to question the legitimacy of their treatments. Drew, who once stood confidently behind every press release, suddenly found himself isolated. Former allies distanced themselves. Political supporters withdrew their endorsements. Even Carly, who had stood by him through countless controversies, could no longer ignore the mountain of evidence, and the depth of pain now attached to his name. In private, she questioned whether the man she once loved had lost sight of humanity in his pursuit of greatness. Meanwhile, Trina became a beacon for patient advocacy, using her platform to expose the dangers of unregulated medical ambition. She gave interviews, met with lawmakers, and launched a foundation in Kai's name to protect future patients from becoming victims of unchecked experimentation. Her transformation from supportive partner to fierce advocate was swift and undeniable. She refused to let Kai's suffering be reduced to a tragic footnote. And Kai, confined to a wheelchair, began the slow, painful process of rebuilding his life. He spoke publicly about his journey, not to inspire pity, but to demand accountability. In televised interviews, he recounted how Drew had promised him that the surgery would change everything, and it had, just not in the way either of them had imagined. His words, filled with anguish and fury, reverberated across the country. "He told me I would stand taller than ever," Kai said during one interview. "Now, I can't even stand at all." Port Charles would never forget what happened that night at the nurses' ball. Not because of the glittering gowns or the music or the grand speeches, but because a young man believed in something too soon, too deeply, and paid the price for trusting the wrong person. And as for Drew, the man who once shaped narratives with confidence and charisma, he now faced a new reality. No longer the architect of miracles, but the cautionary tale of what happens when ambition tramples ethics, and hope becomes collateral damage. In the days that followed, a tidal wave of public outrage engulfed Port Charles, and it showed no signs of subsiding. The once quiet murmurs of doubt about Drew's involvement in Kai's downfall exploded into full-blown fury. Curtis, never one to miss an opportunity to strike at a political rival, seized the moment with surgical precision. Standing at the steps of City Hall surrounded by cameras and reporters, he denounced Drew in the harshest terms yet, calling him the man who destroyed the future of a medical prodigy. His words echoed throughout news broadcasts, online forums, and editorials. Drew, who had carefully cultivated the image of a benevolent visionary, was now being framed as a manipulative opportunist whose hunger for prestige had cost a young man his mobility, and nearly, his life. At the center of this growing movement stood Trina, now no longer seen merely as Kai's devoted partner, but as a rising force for ethical reform. Fueled by grief and righteous indignation, she began aligning herself with national medical advocacy organizations. She gave impassioned speeches, stood on protest lines, and testified before panels. Her message was clear: the medical system had failed, and political interference had corrupted the sanctity of scientific discovery. She used Kai's case as a lightning rod to ignite debate on the dangers of unchecked experimental procedures and the necessity for comprehensive informed consent. Her voice, raw and unwavering, resonated far beyond Port Charles. She was invited to appear on national television, featured in investigative exposés, and praised in op-eds as the face of a new wave of patient rights activism. Amid this uproar, the government moved swiftly. Drew was summoned to an emergency ethics hearing before the Senate Oversight Committee on Health and Human Research. The hearing, streamed live across multiple networks, was a humiliating spectacle for the man who had once stood behind podiums delivering promises of innovation and progress. Now, he sat before a panel of scowling senators, questioned not as a visionary but as a potentially negligent and ethically compromised public servant. He was accused of leveraging his authority as a sitting senator to push through funding for a trial that had not met the necessary safety thresholds, of misrepresenting the nature and risks of the procedure to both the medical board and to Kai, and of failing to ensure proper consent had been obtained. Transcripts of internal emails were submitted into evidence, showing Drew urging the medical team to move forward quickly to secure optics ahead of campaign season. As Drew's political life unraveled, Kai's personal tragedy became the emblem of systemic failure. News outlets began chronicling his every step, from his grueling physical therapy sessions, where he grimaced through pain with tears rolling silently down his cheeks, to his moments of fragile triumph, like when he lifted himself from the chair to a walker, only to collapse moments later. But it was not the image of Kai in pain that captivated the public most. It was his resilience, his insistence on being heard, and his unrelenting determination to hold Drew accountable. Kai gave several televised interviews that quickly went viral. In one particularly searing moment, he described the night before the surgery, how he sat in a hospital room staring at the ceiling, riddled with doubt, ready to back out. But then Drew arrived, flanked by a team of researchers and PR officials, reassuring him with promises of safety, progress, and glory. They showed him graphs, statistics, endorsements. They told him he would be remembered as the one who paved the way. He recalled how Drew smiled at him and said, "You'll walk across that nurse's ball stage stronger than ever." But now, Kai said bitterly, the only place he walked to was the edge of his own destruction. These interviews spread like wildfire. People who had once campaigned for Drew now stood in protest outside his office. Members of the medical board, fearing backlash, launched internal investigations. Former campaign donors withdrew their support, citing ethical concerns. Allies in government suddenly became unavailable for comment. And perhaps most painfully, longtime friends and partners began distancing themselves. The political machine that Drew had spent years building began to crumble beneath him. Inside the walls of General Hospital, whispers grew louder. Doctors debated whether they had been complicit. Nurses exchanged theories in break rooms. Administrative staff began re-evaluating their own roles in past experimental procedures. A culture of silence and unquestioned authority was being dismantled piece by piece, largely because one young man refused to remain silent. Despite his suffering, Kai emerged as a symbol of both the dangers and the potential for redemption within the system. He launched a new initiative with Trina, a foundation dedicated to patient advocacy, education on medical ethics, and whistleblower protection for healthcare professionals pressured by politics. Their first major summit drew in attendees from across the country, researchers, ethicists, survivors of failed clinical trials, and lawmakers. In a powerful opening address, Kai rolled himself onto the stage, raised his voice over the standing ovation, and said, "I was supposed to be a miracle. Instead, I became a warning. But that doesn't mean I can't still change lives, just not in the way I once thought." Drew, watching from the shadows of what used to be a promising political career, could do little but endure the consequences. He issued public apologies, pled for understanding, and claimed he had only wanted to help. But the damage had been done. His name would forever be tied to the scandal. No longer was he the senator who funded medical innovation. Now, he was the man who gambled with a young man's future and lost everything. And for Kai, though his legs no longer moved, his voice had never been stronger. He had become the truth that power tried to silence, and a reminder to Port Charles and beyond that no advancement is worth the price of human dignity. Drew, once hailed as a visionary political leader with a philanthropic streak, had now become the epicenter of a firestorm he could no longer control. The outrage was visceral and relentless. Protesters gathered daily outside his senatorial office, waving hand-painted signs that read, "Not a hero, just a tyrant, justice for Kai," and "Patients aren't pawns." The anger spilled beyond chants and slogans. Threatening letters began arriving at his private residence, each one darker and more menacing than the last. His security detail had to be doubled. Neighbors grew wary. The media hounded him relentlessly, capturing every grimace, every refusal to speak, every stumble he made under the weight of scrutiny. The man who once inspired confidence and admiration was now met with suspicion and hostility wherever he went. Drew's political alliances, so carefully nurtured over years of networking and negotiation, began to fracture like glass under pressure. Key donors, alarmed by the fallout, quietly pulled their financial support. Event invitations dried up. Colleagues refused to appear with him in public. In private strategy sessions, staffers offered only silence when Drew demanded to know why no one was defending him. And the silence was deafening. Even Carly, who had once stood firmly by his side through past controversies and political storms, was no longer offering her unwavering support. The accusations from Trina had shaken her deeply. She had looked into Drew's eyes for years and believed in his goodness, but now she couldn't help but wonder, had she been deceived all along? In one particularly tense internal meeting, as the team huddled in a war room filled with charts, polls, and crisis memos, Drew's composure finally cracked. Slamming a fist on the table, his voice hoarse with exhaustion, he shouted, "I was trying to help. I believed in this." The outburst was followed by a haunting stillness. The very people who once believed in him, who once repeated his rhetoric of progress and innovation, now offered no words of reassurance. Their eyes darted away, unsure whether to pity him or condemn him. In that silence, Drew felt the truth more clearly than any public condemnation: he was alone. In the sleepless nights that followed, Drew wandered through the ruins of his career and began to interrogate his own motives. Was he truly blinded by the hope of medical advancement, or had he willingly ignored red flags because the promise of a political legacy was too tempting to resist? He sat alone in his office, reviewing the very research that had once been his beacon. The reports were damning in hindsight: inconclusive data, vague language, a litany of unanswered questions buried beneath glowing forecasts. And then he remembered the night before Kai's surgery. How the young man's hands trembled as he held the consent form, how his voice wavered as he asked one final time, "Are you sure?" Drew hadn't stopped him. He hadn't said no. Because at that moment, he needed Kai to say yes more than Kai needed to be protected. But the nightmare was only deepening. A coalition of attorneys specializing in medical malpractice and governmental ethics was preparing a lawsuit. Not just one, but several. The first came from Kai himself. A comprehensive civil suit accusing Drew of ethical violations, coercion, and fraudulent misrepresentation. But Kai was not alone. Other participants in programs funded by Drew's initiatives began coming forward, each with their own stories of promises unfulfilled, side effects minimized, and risks downplayed. Depositions were being scheduled. Discovery requests flooded Drew's legal team. What had once been a singular tragedy now loomed as a class action scandal with national implications. Through all this, Kai remained the steady, unwavering voice of truth. No longer a naive young man dazzled by dreams of becoming a medical legend, he had transformed into a fierce advocate for justice. From his wheelchair, he addressed reporters with quiet intensity, never raising his voice, but delivering words that struck harder than any yell. He didn't just want compensation. He wanted accountability. "It wasn't just my legs they took," he said during a televised press conference. "It was my trust. My dignity. My belief that people in power cared more about lives than headlines. I'm not here to be your inspiration. I'm here to make sure no one else has to pay the price I did." Kai's declaration echoed across the nation. News outlets began calling the scandal the Kai Taylor reckoning. Editorials praised his courage. Medical schools began re-examining their experimental ethics policies. Advocacy groups used his story as a training case. A movement had been born from his suffering, one that was bigger than just Drew, bigger than General Hospital, bigger even than Port Charles. And Drew? He remained in the shadows of a life he once lived with purpose and prestige. He continued to plead his case, in interviews, in statements, in closed-door meetings, but no one was listening anymore. The man who had once dominated rooms with his presence now sat in hearings with sunken eyes, a shell of the confident figure he had once been. No speechwriter could spin this. No donation could undo it. The truth was too raw. The pain too real. The betrayal too personal. Kai Taylor was no longer just the broken patient on a stretcher. He was the living proof that one wrong decision, no matter how noble it seemed, could unravel everything. He had become the voice for every silenced patient, the face of every overlooked risk, the soul of a system crying out for reform. And as the people of Port Charles continued to reckon with the scandal, one thing became undeniable: they would never look at Drew the same way again. Not as a leader. Not as a savior. But as the man who gambled with hope and lost it all.